There is that in the movie industry where these producers and directors take advantage of their position, and they have a lot of vulnerable young women, as an example, and they aspire to get to that level of fame and fortune, and they're hanging out with these people and they're willing to say and do anything, and they'll keep quiet if they're asked about it. So yeah, I think that there is that code of silence that exists. It's the underbelly of that industry, the music and the acting business. Not everyone's so lucky to get a role and have their career launched. Some of them have to fight very hard to get their foot in the door.
Welcome back to A Voice and Beyond. We have James Porfido, all the way from New Jersey. How are you?
I'm doing great, Dr. Marissa. So nice to be back, and thank you for having me back.
Some of the stuff that you have to share is so fascinating, and I know our listeners are going to love it because as a society, we are so captivated by high-profile criminal cases, true crime, unsolved murder mysteries, and everyone has an opinion about some of these cases. And today, we're going to have a conversation around justice, truth, media influence, celebrity culture, and accountability. And James, what is the biggest takeaway that you hope our listeners will be left with from our conversation?
Well, it's really not in the court of public opinion. It's in the courtroom where the cases are decided. But unfortunately, people come up with verdicts before they've ever heard evidence in the court of public opinion. So they really don't know the ins and outs of the case. They don't know what evidence is allowed in or will come in. And ultimately, they come to their own conclusions based on opinions and based on the way the media presents it to them.
So true. And why do you think cases involving celebrities and high-profile people capture our attention in a way that most other criminal cases don't?
I think it's a dose of humanity is what I think. That even people that are rich and famous can commit these types of crimes and be under the microscope and subject to the same system that we're all subject to in the United States or wherever you may be, the criminal justice system. And I think it normalizes or equalizes them and takes them off of that pedestal.
And is it also too that in many cases we feel like we know the people? Like, for example, we're going to talk about Michael Jackson a little bit later on, but we've watched him grow up.
Right.
And we feel, we've known this person for 30 years. We've watched his journey with his brothers, and now, and then he completely transformed himself, but we've been along for the ride as the public. So is that maybe why we're so invested also?
Well, yeah, I think having that knowledge and that awareness and being connected to someone, even though we're really not, seeing them on the big screen or seeing them on the small screen or hearing their music over a period of time or seeing them perform or going to a concert, whatever it may be, you feel like you have a closer connection to that individual. Or you may have formulated some opinions about that person. Like, for instance, Michael Jackson. People had their own opinions about him, whether he was a pedophile, was he acting bizarre, and, the way he presented himself in public, the fact that he basically reinvented himself through plastic surgery. So people kind of had their own opinions about him before he was ever charged with anything criminally.
And a lot of these cases too, like with Jeffrey Epstein, P. Diddy, they become a cultural phenomena, and they seem to be more than just a legal proceeding. They go beyond that. And in these cases, it seems that as the general public, we become more fascinated by famous defendants than what we do with the actual victims. We seem to forget about the victims. And Like, do we care about them? Do people care about the victims? Or are we just following to see what is happening with the actual defendants in these big cases?
You're absolutely right. I mean, the victims are often forgotten in these cases where you have these high profile people that are put on trial and charged with these offenses. Then people kind of like, they learn a lot more about that person because then you hear much more than you ever knew about that individual. And in the case of Jeffrey Epstein, I mean, nobody really knew who he was and what he was all about. And then you find out that he was rubbing elbows with the most famous people, for instance, Prince Andrew. He's hanging out with leaders of countries. There's so much to that. It's very fascinating. And the amount of wealth and like, how did he accumulate that wealth? And then you're right, the poor victims in the case, they're forgotten and they want their story to be told and they want this person to be held to a standard of justice. They want them to be brought to justice. And sometimes that's forgotten in all of the limelight that's brought to the case and all the media attention and focus that's brought to the case.
And do celebrity cases, in your opinion, become a way for society to wrestle with bigger picture questions about power, morality, and accountability? And can these cases create a shift in core values as well?
You hit the nail on the head exactly with this, because if you have these high profile individuals, these people that have, amazing wealth, let's say, they have endless resources that not everybody has that. I mean, they have the ability to hire the best attorneys, the best experts, and, the person on the street does not have that same ability. So it kind of makes the system questionable. Are the scales truly equal? Are the scales of justice equal for everyone? Or do these people have an unfair advantage because they have the ability to bring in the best of the best?
Absolutely. And the other thing, too, that seems to happen in these cases is that people feel they have such a strong need to choose sides before all the facts are known, based on their opinion of the person, whether they like that celebrity or that high-profile person. And one of the challenges in today's world is that public opinion often forms before a trial even begins. So how does that affect justice in the courtroom?
You made me think of the O.J. Simpson case. And I remember being a young prosecutor at the time and even I'm not sure that I did commentary on the first case or the second case, but definitely the second case when he tried to rob his own memorabilia and broke into a hotel room. I know that I did commentary on that case, but I do remember a lot about that first case. And it was really divided by race. Sadly, people weren't really listening to the evidence in the case as to whether or not he was guilty or not guilty and whether the state could support those charges with the evidence. It wasn't about that, unfortunately. And, that really started, that dichotomy changed dramatically throughout the course of the case. And I think that continuum presented itself throughout. From the beginning to the end of the case, it was divided on racial lines and racial tensions. And you saw that with the verdict. When he was found not guilty, African Americans were cheering and celebrating, and white people were questioning, how could that happen? The evidence was so overwhelming, the bloody glove, the fact that he fled the scene, that he was eluding the police in this chase, with the white Bronco that we all remember.
We all remember.
So there was so much evidence that was almost overwhelming in the case. And then you had, Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden, the prosecutors in the case, that were outgunned and outmanned by the defense. And that gets us to the point that we made earlier, is about the money. I mean, it was the dream team. O.J. Simpson amassed the best of the best defense attorneys. I mean, guys like, Shapiro and Jerry Spence, Alan Dershowitz, Barry Scheck. These were people that were in the know. These were the people handling all the high profile cases. And he put that team together. I don't think the prosecution was ready for that, quite frankly. They weren't as skilled.
It's unbelievable to think that not guilty came back, that verdict came back with all that evidence. I mean, that blows my mind.
Well, then you look at the civil case and how quickly he was found liable. Now, civil is a very different standard that listeners need to understand. In a criminal proceeding, it's beyond a reasonable doubt is the standard of proof or the evidence. So the jury has to base their verdict beyond reasonable doubt. In a civil case, it's a preponderance of the evidence, which is just a slight amount. But in the civil case, in the OJ proceedings, it didn't take the jury long at all to determine that he was responsible for the deaths and that there was going to be monetary damages assessed, which were significant for the deaths of Ronald Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson.
Yes. So what is the difference then between allegations, evidence, and proof? What defines each one of those?
Sure. Well, allegations are simply saying someone did something, and to charge somebody, the level of the standard is probable cause, which is not a high standard. Probably the individual committed the crime and probably the evidence supports it. So it's a probable standard. That gets an arrest. Now the allegation has now led to an arrest. And now when you get to a trial, the evidence has to be on the side of the state. It has to be beyond a reasonable doubt, which is, I think, overwhelming. You have to demonstrate that the evidence is pretty compelling, that a jury is convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that this individual is guilty, and it has to be unanimous. So there's a jury of 12. That means all 12 people have to agree.
So these jury members, they're a member of the public. And sometimes the public narrative becomes stronger than the facts themselves. So as a jury member, what kinds of questions should they be asking themselves just to be sure that they are delivering the correct verdict?
Well, first and foremost is they have to pass the test to be a juror in the case, which is that they have to be able to tell the court when the questioning is called voir dire. When they're voir dired on whether or not they can qualify as a juror, they're asked a number of questions. And one of them, most significant of all, is can you be fair and impartial and listen to the evidence, number one. And number two, follow the instructions of the court when it comes to the charging of the law. Those are pretty significant things. And, I don't know that it's given a lot of thought. That's a really awesome responsibility that a jury has to be able to answer that question, that they can be fair and impartial and listen to the evidence clearly with an open mind, because it's very hard to do that because people have opinions. They have biases.
Yes.
Before they ever take that position in a jury box, they bring their life experience. And that's what I often said is, hey, bring your life experience into this. Does it make sense or does it not make sense? You don't want them to ignore the fact that they have the life experience. You want them to draw on that life experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, at the end of the day, we're all human. We all have emotions, feelings, past traumas, experiences that shape who we are. And it's hard to let go of those at the door.
I think it's probably impossible to do that. And, any little outside influence, and I'm thinking about the case of Murtaugh that was just overturned, his verdict. He was accused and convicted of killing his wife and son in South Carolina, I believe. And it was a pretty high profile case. And in fact, there's a Netflix show about it, about the murder. He was an attorney. His family was very influential in that area of South Carolina, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was South Carolina. And his father was a lawyer. His grandfather was a judge. So they kind of were in that circle of people, and they knew their way in and out of the court. And certainly his name was well known. Well, the jury, it wasn't the foreperson. It was someone actually employed by the county that was writing a book. It was, I don't know what her title was, whether she was the jury manager, but her job was basically to assemble the jury every day, get them in and out of the jury deliberation room, make sure they were seated, all that. She was writing a book. She felt that this was a story to be told, and she was telling people, look, she started to influence the jurors and said, this is a very powerful case. You're involved in the case of the century. And she was telling them that Murtaugh was going to testify in the case. And he didn't have to testify because you have a Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and testimony. Well, she had kind of planted the seed in their mind that he was guilty, that no matter what he said, he's not to be believed.
Wow.
And ultimately, the jury rendered a verdict of guilty, and the defense appealed because they found out that this woman was influencing the jurors and actually wrote a book. And I believe she called it The Trial of the Century. And she talked about her experiences and speaking to the jurors. She basically disclosed everything, that she spoke to these jurors and somewhat influenced them in their verdict. So the verdict was overturned and it's been appealed, and he was successful in his appeal. So he's going to be retried for the murder again.
That is crazy. That is crazy.
Yeah, and the Netflix show was very interesting because it really was a bird's eye view into the case and a lot about him, because ultimately he was stealing money from clients to the tune of well over several $1 million on personal injury cases where he was not giving them the full recovery that they were entitled to. And ultimately, I believe he pled guilty to that, and he's not getting out. He's facing 20 years for those charges alone.
Incredible.
And I believe he's about 60 years old. So
You have headlines and you have media outlets who all have their own opinions and biases. I mean, just look at Fox News versus CNN.
of course, yeah, very different opinions you'll get.
Very different opinions. It never ceases to amaze me, actually, when I'm overseas.
Yeah, it boggles my mind too. You turn the channel and you say, wait, did I miss something? One story on one news outlet is so different than the other news outlet and covered with very different opinions.
So therefore, what responsibility do these media outlets have when covering these cases? Because some of them blatantly lie.
Yes.
I mean, someone's got to be lying when you have two different media outlets portraying totally different headline. Someone is clearly lying. But so where is their responsibility and lie? And what about accountability? Is there no accountability here?
There absolutely is, and there should be. And I think that we live in such a divided society in the United States right now, sadly.
Oh, yes.
I think the job of a reporter is to report the facts and let the listener come to their own conclusions, the facts that they know them to be without opinions. And that's very challenging because depending on which news outlet you subscribe to and listen to or watch,
yes,
you're getting a different opinion. You're getting a very different opinion. And I think people hear that and they're influenced by that. And I always say, educate yourself. Make sure you know everything before you come to a conclusion. Don't jump first. You should make sure that you know all your facts and be aware. I mean, we just had an expose about Dr. Anthony Fauci. That was a big thing. Tulsi Gabbard's last day as the Secretary of Interior. She gave a huge expose that Anthony Fauci had lied to Congress and lied about the COVID cover-up. And people just did not want to hear that. And depending on which side of the aisle you were on, you were getting a very different view about what COVID was all about and how it affected society and the people in society. And many of the people that died, did not have to die, or they died deaths where, they should have had loved ones there and they were not allowed to. So there's a lot to this. I mean, there's a lot to unpackage. And you can have your own opinions, but you should really educate yourself and inform. Look for the facts, different sides. Be cognizant of both sides and say, okay, I want to hear both sides and I'm going to come to my own conclusion. And sadly, that doesn't happen enough.
Well, it can't if you have media outlets that are telling their own version of the facts. People don't know who to believe. And then you have social media that's also changed the way that we are involved in these cases.
Yes, of course.
They put their own spin on it. And then you have individuals on social media. And then you have now Netflix. They seem to be releasing documentaries on so many of these high-profile cases. They had the Menendez brothers. They've had the Michael Jackson one has just been released. There are so many.
There are.
And they must influence.
Yeah, I think the audience is intrigued by it. There's like an appetite for this in the public to hear these cases and hear the inside details. You know, O.J. Simpson, there's been so many shows about O.J. Simpson's trial. I just talked about the Murtaugh case. That's one that's on Netflix. And I believe I just watched one. And I wish I could remember. It was in England about a serial killer who was killing women in a park. And the police had done a very shoddy job. They had a suspect and they never went forward to question the suspect. And he ended up killing 3 more people. 3 more women in this same park, and that was their killer. And had they done their job correctly, those lives would have been saved. And it was a very sad story because there was a young boy who was present with his mom when she was murdered. And he grew up, you know, with that memory of that event.
So once these shows are released, and there's another element of truth that comes out based on the release of this documentary, can then the verdict or the outcome of that case be flipped? Can there be a retrial based on a documentary, or is that it? Like once there is a verdict, that verdict is then cemented, it's done, it's dusted, or can we then say, oh, there are new facts that have come to light. Let's now relook at this case.
There's many levels to that question for sure. If there is new evidence that's discovered, that is a basis for an appeal and to have the courts undo what's been done in terms of a conviction. If there's newly discovered evidence, if an appeal is filed and it's successful, the case can be retried or relitigated and perhaps overturned if they have a retrial. Sometimes there's out and out DNA evidence, which demonstrates that the individual was not the source of whatever the evidence was. That has exonerated people over the years, but that's been done through the courts by applications by defense attorneys under Project Innocence. And generally the state joins in those applications or those motions to the court if they are convinced that they did the wrong thing, that somebody is being wrongfully imprisoned for something they did not do. Mm-hmm. And that's the right thing to do. And prosecutors should join in those applications and should not fight those if there's clear, compelling evidence like DNA that this person did not do that. So, you know, there's several layers to that. But if the case has been tried and someone's been found guilty and there's no new evidence, and there's no defense attorney fighting for that person who's been convicted, they're just going to sit in jail, unfortunately. And that has happened.
Do you know of any cases in your experience, because you've been a prosecutor, you've also been a defense attorney, you've sat on both sides of the fence, and you have also delivered commentary on media outlets around different cases and their progress. Are there any cases where you feel someone has been wrongly tried, either someone innocent was found guilty or someone guilty, you thought, oh, okay, well, you know, maybe they'd been let off and...
Interesting. I mean, I think my eyes were opened as a result of reading a book. And, you know, John Grisham does not need me to promote his book, but he just recently wrote a book. I think it was last year. And Jack Canfield, the author of Chicken Soup for the Soul, actually told me about the book. and said, you might want to read this book. It's called Framed. And the case is broken down into 5 real life stories. And John Grisham, I think he only wrote 2 books about actual true, nonfiction, that they were true events.
Right.
And he picked 5 cases, and a gentleman by the name of James, I believe, McCullough, who was part of the Princeton Project, he had to put 5 cases together as well as John Grisham. And they talked about some cases that would make your blood boil. Really. People that were wrongfully charged and arrested and ultimately convicted and sentenced to very, very significant periods of time in custody and incarceration. And the verdict or the outcome of the case was wrong, clearly wrong, based on lying witnesses, jailhouse informants that were being basically compensated for their freedom. They were let go in exchange for their testimony. So they were lying to convict these people that were clearly innocent. Many of them spent well over 20 years incarcerated for these offenses they did not commit. And sadly, and there's another Netflix show, I think it's called not The Burning Bed, something burning.
Okay.
It's about one of the cases they talk about. And this father was accused of lighting his house on fire and killing his 2 children. And he professed his innocence. He said, I did not do this. I would never do this. And he was a target. They wanted very much to convict this man, despite the fact that there was no evidence. And ultimately, he was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. To death. He was sentenced to death. And this is the only case in the entire book. He was ultimately sentenced to death and executed and did not commit the crime. An expert later came into the case and said this was not arson at all. It was an electrical fire. It was an accident.
Oh, my gosh.
And he said over and over, I did not do this. I did not do this. I would never do this. And he was convicted. And they used an arson investigator on the side of the prosecution. The state's witness was an arson expert that really was not qualified to testify. He had only testified in maybe 2 cases before, and it was his opinion. And this is what the jury based their verdict on, is that he committed the fire. That based on the evidence that was there, he definitely set the fire, and it was a clear act of arson. And when it was examined by a very trained, skilled forensic expert who was trained in arson investigations and had testified many, many times, he said, this was all wrong. This opinion that he gave and the jury based their verdict on, and this man was put to death.
How sad. That is tragic.
It was in the state of Texas.
That is so tragic. Wow.
Yeah, and it is the subject of a Netflix show, I believe.
Well, talking about Netflix, I did start watching the Michael Jackson documentary.
Sure.
Which is interesting because that's come out the same time that his movie has come out, that his nephew plays him in a movie where they celebrate his life. So you have the Netflix documentary that reveals the dark side of him and the movie that celebrates the star that he was. I only watched a small part of it just because of time. And, it was visiting the Neverland Ranch, the amusement park there, and seeing what he created there was incredible. And you could see clearly it was someone who was deprived of a childhood somewhat and trying to reclaim that childhood. And that was terribly sad. But then there was a very dark and mysterious part of him where he even revealed that he was sleeping with young boys. He was inviting them into his own bed. And he said that clearly. So with this Michael Jackson thing, we seem to never be able to have enough of this whole story because he is one of those people. We watched him grow up. We feel very invested. You know, we see that side where we have compassion. We celebrate his artistry. But then there's this really wacko side. And I mean, wacko is it. What do you see with all your years of experience in the legal system, having sat on both sides of the fence? What do you make of that whole case?
You know, that's interesting because I did commentary on court TV many times on that case. I had a very strong opinion about the fact that I thought that he was guilty. And I think that I came to that conclusion not so much simply by the evidence, but my own opinion. You know, his nickname was Wacko Jacko.
Yeah.
That was his nickname.
Yeah, deserved.
Because of the behavior he engaged in and the lifestyle he was living in. And I agree with you that I think that he was deprived of many things as a child because he really never had the ability to live his life because he was always performing with his family. And I think his father was a very tough taskmaster. And that all came out at some point, how his father was did not treat him very well. You know, I just had my own opinion that somebody that admits that they have young boys in their bed and invites them over, I thought that was a little strange.
Oh, very.
Beyond strange.
Beyond, yes.
Beyond strange. I thought it was criminal, you know, and I had my own opinions about that. And I really believed that the jury would ultimately find him guilty of this. But the defense attorneys, now I'm trying to remember who the defense attorney was at the time because he's someone that's pretty famous and has done a lot of cases. He did Scott Peterson's case, and I cannot think of his name. I can see his face too. Mm-hmm. But he was Michael Jackson's attorney, and he did a very good job with his private investigators of determining that these civil lawsuits had been filed by the families of these young boys that were going to be testifying as the victims in the case. And it really became discrediting them, saying basically that they were not telling the truth because they had a financial incentive in this case. They had a financial stake in the outcome. So the jury started to think, well, maybe they just want to get rich. Maybe they just want, you know, his money. And one had nothing to do with the other, but in the jurors' minds, I believe they could not separate that out. And they ultimately found him not guilty because they believed that the young boys were lying, that their parents or their mom, in one particular instance, had put them up to saying some of these things that were pretty graphic. And, you know, so ultimately, I think the jury was swayed in that direction. And I was wrong. I admit I was wrong. I did not believe that was going to be the outcome of the case.
Were you shocked by that?
I was pretty surprised by it, but then when I saw the approach that the defense took in the case, I understood it. I could see that they discredited these witnesses and the jury was able to discount what they were saying, even to the point of saying, well, they might be fabricating this. They might be making this up.
Yes. And it's kind of weird too that these boys were sleeping in the bed with Michael Jackson. Where were the parents?
Yeah.
The parents were allowing this to happen.
Right.
And then they go and sue him afterwards. That is in itself is really bizarre. If they were concerned, they shouldn't have let that happen in the first place. But to allow their child to sleep with him and then go, oh, we want your money now because you slept with our child. Well, where were you when this was happening?
Yeah, well, it was the same motivation. They probably felt that allowing their kids to hang around with Michael Jackson was going to pay dividends in a lot of ways, that he would take care of them and take care of the families. And maybe that didn't come to fruition. Maybe they didn't get what they expected and they retaliated by filing these civil lawsuits. But I agree with you. Where were they? What kind of parent is that would allow for that?
Exactly.
They're totally unsupervised, and you have questions about this person's character and whether or not they're a pedophile because there were past allegations. It wasn't like this was all new.
Do you think that if Michael Jackson wasn't Michael Jackson and it was someone else, it was just the average person, it wasn't a profile celebrity, someone with money, that he would have been convicted?
I do believe that. Yes, I do. Because the reason I say that, and there's a couple of reasons, but the primary reason is he had extremely good counsel. He had a great defense attorney. They had the ability to do an investigation and get access to statements that were made before the trial, and then to compare it with what was testified to at trial to show the inconsistencies and perhaps even outright lies. So, yeah, I think if it were someone else, they would not have the ability to do what he was able to do simply because of the resources that he had.
And you wonder too, had he still been alive, had all this come to life again, where all this would have ended up, if there would have been other trials, other people come forward?
I believe, look at Harvey Weinstein. That's another one. And I did commentary on that case as well. And I'm certainly not patting myself on the back, but I was doing commentary the day the verdict came in. And I felt that the verdict was going to be overturned based on an appeal issue. And that was that the judge allowed other women to come forward and testify, even though he was not charged with sexually abusing them. They came forward as what they call other bad acts evidence. It's a rule of evidence that allows the prosecution to bring in this type of evidence to show that there's a pattern of behavior, an absence of mistake. And the judge allowed it. And I said, the jury is going to convict him because they've heard these other women say it happened to them. And he's not on trial for that.
Yes.
In their minds, they're not going to unring the bell. So they're going to hear, well, if it happened to them, it must have happened to her.
Yeah.
So she must be telling the truth.
Yes.
So therefore, he's guilty. And that's exactly what they did. And that was the basis upon which the verdict was overturned, is that the judge had allowed that evidence in. So again, I'm not patting myself on the back, but I saw that is a potential problem.
Yes. And then too, you have the Epstein case that never seems to leave our TVs and media outlets. And, that case has triggered an enormous amount of publicity, and rightly so. But before we get into the case itself, do you believe that he committed suicide in jail, or do you believe there was foul play involved? I'm really putting you on the spot here.
No, I listen, I've always suspected there was foul play. And I think that the fact that there was several seconds missing from the tape from his cell, I think that confirms it in my mind. I mean, it's my opinion, but I feel like somebody wanted him dead because he had a lot to tell. He was going to reveal a lot of secrets against a lot of people. So there were a lot of people that wanted him dead.
Yes.
So I don't believe he committed suicide. I don't believe that. I don't. I believe he was so brash and so arrogant that he probably would have gone to trial and would have had the best attorneys, quite frankly, and challenged the evidence. So I don't believe it. I don't. From his history, I mean, he pled guilty to an offense in Florida, and I think he did like 90 days in jail or something. And that was a whole big question as to whether the district attorney was, paid off or who he was being influenced by in order to give him such a sweetheart deal. But yeah, I do believe there was a reason for him to be killed. Yes.
So with this case, what do you believe is the greatest mystery or fascination around it? Is it what the allegations themselves were? The possible blackmail allegations, the power, the influence of money, the people that he was surrounded by, the names of the people that keep coming up. Like I read that Bill Gates's name was thrown in there. Prince Andrew, who's now no longer Prince, he's Andrew Mountbatten, Sarah Ferguson, the Clintons, President Trump, like so many names. It's almost like whose name isn't on the list.
Yeah, it's like a who's who he surrounded himself with, those influential people. And that's why there's many more questions to be asked. And, you asked me, like, what's the burning question? The burning question in my mind is, why is Ghislaine Maxwell sitting in custody, and why haven't they brought her in and said, listen, we'll release you tomorrow if you tell us everybody, give us the names. And I want to know where these surveillance tapes are, because we know that he had surveillance cameras in all of his homes. Very, very high tech, where he filmed everything, because that was going to be his vehicle for extortion of some of these people that were engaged in these inappropriate acts, these sexual acts against these young women. I believe he used that as a form of extortion to blackmail them. I want to know where those tapes are. There's got to be unbelievable amounts of evidence that exist. And I know Ghislaine Maxwell is a walking encyclopedia, and I want to know why they haven't utilized her. Any good prosecutor would get her to cooperate and would reduce or commute her sentence in exchange for her coming forward to tell what she has to tell, because she's got a lot to talk about.
Do you believe that perhaps there are people in high places who are making sure that she doesn't talk? Because you're saying you don't understand why she isn't speaking. So what would be the reason for her not to speak, unless there's people that don't want her opening her mouth?
She may be speaking, but I don't know who's listening. That's the question. I want to know who's listening, who's taking the time to interview her and get the information that she can provide, because I believe she knows so much.
Of course.
And why haven't they used that information? I mean, I believe she could testify against some very, very influential people.
Oh.
Maybe they're trying to keep this quiet. Maybe that's what's happening. It could be what's happening. And I may be wrong about that. I know Todd Blanche, who is now the acting attorney general, who took over for Pam Bondi. I know he interviewed her. I would be interested in knowing what exactly he was able to learn, and what, if any, deal are they going to make with her? Because I got to believe there's a deal in the works. If they don't, they're foolish. To me, having been in that position and not utilizing her for the information she has, it's just stupid.
And it also starts to make you question about accountability and transparency. Who's hiding what? And why haven't they been held accountable? And do you believe people like Trump have been involved with Epstein in a criminal way? Like they have been involved, he has been involved in some of these actions that...
I don't believe so. I believe all of the victims that have been interviewed have all said that he was not involved. Everyone that I have heard interviewed about, and they've asked him, they've inquired about this. And Trump came out quite candidly and said he kicked him out of Mar-a-Lago when he found out that he was like taking these young girls that were masseuses and trying to employ them, or he was looking at, and the proximity is now, I've been there to, not to Mar-a-Lago, but where Epstein lives versus where Mar-a-Lago is literally less than a mile.
Wow.
Not even a mile, maybe a half a mile.
So very close.
So he could have walked there routinely. And I believe he was a member there at one point, and Trump kicked him out and said, I don't want him here. I don't want him around other members, other guests. So I don't think it involved him. I really don't. From what I know and what I've heard, the young women that were interviewed all said no. Now, Clinton has been on the plane, 16 times on his private jet to his island? That to me raises some questions, that to me. And there's other evidence against other people similar to that. People who have been on his private jet and gone to his island. But listen, this was not even discussed under the Biden administration, and it's been out there for how long? It was not even discussed. Now it's become a political thing now.
Yes.
I don't think it's political. I think they need to just go after the people that are responsible, and whoever they are, and they'll be held accountable. I could care less if they're a Democrat or Republican. Doesn't matter to me. If they're a sex offender, they should be prosecuted.
I think the thing that made Trump look guilty was how long it took for those files to be released.
Yeah. I think that's part of the reason why Pam Bondi's no longer the attorney general, is because she came forward with this notebook of all this information that was going to be disclosed, and it was nothing. It really didn't amount to anything.
But all the redactions too. So I think because the length of time it took to release the files, all the redactions in those files made Trump look guilty.
Yeah, I believe that was part of the reason why she's no longer in that position.
Right.
I think he lost confidence in her, and I don't know what, if any, involvement he had in the redactions. I don't know that he did. I believe this is all handled through the Department of Justice. But, there's a lot of questions to be raised here, and I think it could be handled a lot differently, quite frankly, and it should be. I mean, this is something that's a tall order, and people are looking for answers. And you know what? He should give them the answers. And they may not be happy hearing what they have to hear, depending on which side of the aisle they're on. And this is not a political issue. This is about accountability and holding somebody responsible. It has nothing to do with politics. So
Yes.
whoever it was, they should be held accountable. And I don't care what side of the aisle they're on, or whether they're Democrat or Republican. It doesn't matter.
Yes. And I think this is a perfect example of money and power and the impact that can have on a case.
Yeah, I do believe that. I believe there's very high influential people that are very high up on the food chain, let's say, that are pulling strings here and maybe throwing money at this problem to make it go away. And I don't know to what effect it's working. Maybe it is working. I don't know.
Yes, it's all very mysterious.
It is.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be. It should be just
No.
cut and dry. Let's look at the evidence. Let's disclose what the evidence is, and let's go after these people and charge them and arrest them. Those people that are responsible, that we have strong evidence against, that we know that we can support a conviction, we're going to go get them. And I don't care if it's Bill Gates. I don't care who it is. Doesn't matter.
Exactly.
They're not going to influence the right thing to do.
Yes. I think one of the people who suffered the most through this, and, I'm not taking sides here, but probably rightly so, but it's a shame he's the only one, is Andrew Mountbatten. I mean, he's the one who's been stripped of everything. And then you have people like the Clintons, then you have people like Bill Gates just wandering the streets and not impacted at all.
Yeah, that kind of boggles my mind that Andrew was held to this high standard of accountability where others have not. I don't feel bad for him. I think that he deserves what he got, and he clearly was engaged in this type of behavior. But he also knows something. He knows he wasn't there alone. So why aren't they utilizing these people for the information they have? I mean, that's how it works in prosecution. You always look for the big fish. You always are looking for the big fish, and how can you build a case? And you sometimes have to do it, and what I was talking about before, these jailhouse informants, they were lying. These people, they have a motivation to be truthful because it could redeem their credibility in society.
Sounds like there's too many people here who have too much to lose and are making sure that the truth is not getting out there in some way.
I think you're right. And I think there's a lot of big names of a lot of people because he utilized his influence. And I'm amazed by his story. There's actually a story on Netflix about him as well, which is fascinating. I believe it's 3 parts.
About Epstein.
Yes.
I think I've seen it. I tend to watch Colombian soaps on Netflix. Just a little side comment there. But I want to ask you quickly, because I'm in the music industry. There's a lot of creatives that listen to this podcast about P. Diddy.
Right.
Okay. So what do you make of P. Diddy bigger picture? Because there's a lot of conspiracy theories around him, like almost like an underground mafia that exists in the music industry that involves people like Beyonce, Jay-Z, that they have power and influence, and they were involved with Diddy. Do you know anything about that?
I don't, but I did do some commentary on that case as well.
Of course you did.
Surrounding the verdict. And it was a radio station out of Pennsylvania. I can't remember the call letters for the station, but I did a couple of cases on there. P. Diddy was one and Karen Reed was another. I thought in that case, there was so much more that they were going to be able to bring forward as far as the evidence is concerned. And they seem to be focusing much more on the incident with him beating up his girlfriend by the elevator, which we all have seen that video over and over.
Yes.
And they brought out a lot of evidence of him abusing his girlfriend. And that's not what the trial was about. The trial was not about him being an abusive boyfriend and committing assault and battery against her. That was not what the case was about. It was about the sexual acts and how she was, abused and other women were abused. But she was really the only witness. I think that ultimately there was a couple of witnesses that were determined to be not credible. And he ultimately was convicted, but I felt like there was a much bigger picture here. There was a lot more people involved, and they only went after him. I mean, they basically charged him with what's called a RICO violation. And a RICO violation is racketeering. Basically it's used for mob cases. When you're going after the mafia, you want to say that they've infiltrated certain areas, that they're taking over. And that was part of the allegations against P. Diddy, is that he was involved in a RICO violation of racketeering. And that means the enterprise of bringing these women across state lines for sexual favors, basically saying he was a pimp,
Yes.
That's what ultimately the charge was. The violation of the Mann Act was what he was convicted of. And that was that he transported women across state lines for sexual favors. And that's what he was convicted of. But I felt like there was so much more to that case because there were so many more people. It wasn't him alone. And that's where I think this case went sideways, because quite frankly, I thought he was going to be acquitted of everything, because they couldn't really prove directly that he was orchestrating these things. I mean, they had evidence, clearly had evidence of all of this baby oil and all this other crazy stuff that was going on. I mean, just bizarre behavior that was being engaged in. And he was watching or participating in some way, which is hard to believe. Honestly, hard to believe that a human being could treat another human being that way. And I do think the jury ultimately convicted him because they didn't like him. They thought he was a bad guy. And I think he's a bad guy too, but that's not a crime.
Yes.
That's not a crime. But I think that he was portrayed in a very bad light in front of the jury. And ultimately, he was convicted. And I think the evidence was there, certainly, to support the conviction. And the evidence was not there to support the other charges. And that's why he was acquitted of the more serious charges.
No, there is a lot of talk around some kind of mafia. You brought up the word mafia in the music industry, where there's a hierarchy of power, and some of these people were involved with him.
I don't doubt that.
Through some of those parties and things that he was holding, events, this exploitation, and that people are fearful within the music industry and have to show a level of respect to that hierarchy because they're worried about how it will impact their careers.
You're absolutely right. And we talked about the Harvey Weinstein case. That's another example of that, the casting couch. How many of these young actresses went in there looking for work, looking for jobs, thinking they were, going to basically go to meet him, or maybe they didn't. Maybe they were, who goes to a hotel room at 10 o'clock at night or 9 o'clock at night and thinks that that's okay that's going to be an interview for a part in a movie or something, doesn't make sense. So, they discredited themselves by their own actions, but clearly they didn't ask for, nor did they deserve to be treated the way they were or victimized. So I'm not saying that. I'm not excusing that at all, that behavior. But there is that in the movie industry where these producers and directors take advantage of their position, and they have a lot of vulnerable young women. I'm using women as an example to get these roles or these jobs as actresses, and they want these parts. Similar to the music industry where you have people that are aspiring to be, a rising talent, and they aspire to get to that level of fame and fortune, and they're hanging out with these people and they're willing to say and do anything, and they'll keep quiet if they're asked about it.
Exactly.
So yeah, I think that there is that code of silence that exists in those industries, in the movie industry, as well as in the music industry.
Yes. And I do know of people within the music industry who are known within the industry to have been on that casting couch,
right,
so to speak. And that is the only reason why they rose to fame, because some of these people didn't really have a lot of talent, but they made it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of examples of that, I'm sure. And we know that world exists. It's like a subculture in this world. It's the underbelly of that industry,
Yes.
The music and the acting business that people have to fight their way to the top. And not everyone's so lucky as to get a role and have their career launched. Some of them have to fight very hard to get their foot in the door.
Exactly. James, we're going to start wrapping this up. This has been so fascinating, and I could totally talk to you for hours about all this stuff. But in terms of the criminal justice system, what do you believe is the most misunderstood aspect of that system?
Well, everyone, at least in the United States criminal justice system, the idea is you're innocent until you're proven guilty. But I think that that's misunderstood. And I really do believe, having been on both sides, that that's not the case. I often felt walking into courtrooms with a client next to me is that they were automatically viewed as guilty, even though no evidence was ever heard. Not a single piece of evidence was brought forth, but maybe the judges were predisposed to believe that this person was guilty, similar to the prosecutor, because they were charged and were arrested, they must be guilty. And I think that unfortunately is misunderstood, and it's not always the case, and people have to have their day in court, and they're entitled to that. That's part of our system of justice, is that you're entitled to a fair trial and due process. And sadly, not everybody is afforded that right.
Yes. James, behind you, you have the cover of your book. Do you want to share the title of your book and what it's about just quickly? Yeah.
Actually, here's the book here. Unequal Justice, The Search for Truth to Balance the Scales. And it really is about my career in law over 35 plus years as both a prosecutor and defense attorney. And I talk a little bit about being a TV legal analyst and the years I spent doing that. And I still do it. So well over 25 years of that as well. But it's really about the cases, the high profile cases that I prosecuted, as well as the defense cases that I handled, and the perception that I felt being on both sides of the courtroom, as well as some of the changes that happened as a result of COVID, some of the things that I think dramatically changed the system of justice. And I felt, quite frankly, were unfair, and that my clients were being prejudiced by these, let's say, virtual courtrooms like we're doing right now.
Oh, right.
In this podcast.
Right.
We weren't allowed to come into a courtroom, and they actually were doing virtual trials for a period of time. I did not do any. I would not do any. I felt it was unconstitutional to do that, but some attorneys went forward with that. There was a lot of things. The pretrial detentions, people were held in detention. I had 7 people in jail at one time.
Oh my gosh.
And I would scratch my head at night and say, how did this happen?
Yeah.
People charged with very serious offenses, and simply because they were charged, they were almost deemed to be guilty. So they were not getting out. They were staying in jail until we had our day in court or the case got resolved.
Incredible. Well, James, we're going to share the links to your book, to your social media, and to your website. I truly appreciate you being on the show again.
I do too. I really enjoyed the conversation. It was great discussing all these things. Easy to talk about.
Absolutely. And as I said, people can't get enough of all this stuff. So thank you for enlightening us and opening our eyes to another viewpoint and a different way too of seeing these cases. And, perhaps it will help some of us take our lens off too.
Well, we should look at it with an open mind and try to be fair and impartial as tough as it is. I mean, sometimes you hear something and you've already drawn your own conclusions, and maybe that's okay. I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm just saying try to keep an open mind, and try to be objective.
Exactly. Well, thank you again, James, and good luck with everything. And
Thank you.
who knows, we may see you again sometime in the future.
I look forward to it. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.